Tonight's World in Action is the last in the present series. In the past 40 weeks, we've looked at many different stories, from the collapse of British industry to why 301 people lost their lives on Saudi Airlines Flight 163. But tonight we look at the aftermath of the year's most important story from one person's point of view. It began on the day last year when British troops landed on the Falklands. That night, back home in Britain, World in Action began making a programme about the Falklands crisis we called Weekend at War.
Nice. The lads have arrived at the Falkland Islands. The Italians have surrendered just in case.
The film set out to record the mood of a nation at war.
The Irish Air Force are trying to help. They bombed Falkirk last night.
The programme, later to have special significance for one of those involved, found a mood of excitement and defiance that Friday night.
I think we've given them too long.
For the troops as well, I think.
They've been able to dig in too well. We should have gone in 2 or 3 weeks ago.
They're all expansionists. They want to take a little bit here and a little bit there, and pretty soon they'll just want everything for themselves. We can't let that happen.
A few hours later, on Saturday morning, we found a very different mood amongst service families in Portsmouth.
The British flag is flying again on the Falklands. It was raised by Royal Marine Commandos after their landing early yesterday.
We spent that morning with Elaine Evans, a service wife, and her children Anthony and Vicky. Elaine's husband, Ken, was a Marine with 4-5 Commando, one of the first units ashore.
I feel dubious, really, you know. Bit worried, because I don't know where he is, really. If we knew for certain where he was, you know, we'd sort of feel a bit better, I think. But I'm sort of taking it, really, that no news is good news at the moment. Just hope we don't get a phone call or anything.
That morning last year, as Elaine Evans' husband fought in the Falklands, her son, Anthony, paraded with the Marine cadets in Portsmouth. But as Britain waited expectantly for victory, Elaine Evans waited only for news that her husband was safe.
From what was on the television, it seems that the Argentinians didn't put up much of a fight. I mean, it'd be nice to think they wouldn't be much fighting against them. For both sides, really. I mean, it's not nice to think of either of them, especially as so many of the Argentinians are only so young, you know. I hope there isn't much more, but I can't see that there's just going to be nothing else. You know, I think there's got to be something else.
We've fought a war before, we've had casualties before. It's tough luck, but if you're in the forces, that's part of the job.
He doesn't care a damn about lives. He said, I'm prepared to lose 40,000. None of us in this country has said we're prepared to lose 40,000.
He's probably hoping to lose it to help his economy.
They came in waves. They were coming in waves of 6 aircraft, and very low, sweeping up in front of us, dropping their bombs. What they were trying to do was to throw the bombs at us.
When he first went away, it began to sink in a little bit, I think, especially to Anthony, who's sort of nearly 12. He began to realise that there was a possibility that they'd be fighting. But to Vicky, I don't think she really realises even now. And I don't sort of say anything. It's been mentioned perhaps once or twice that there is a possibility that, of course, he might not come back. But, you know, it's like a bad penny, you probably turn up again.
Ken Evans was killed 4 days later. Today, his body lies in the British cemetery at San Carlos Bay, close to where he was killed in an Argentinian bombing raid. Tonight, in World in Action, the story of his widow, Elaine.
The last time I saw Ken, when he went away, we parted on not exactly good terms. He'd borrowed my car and left the windscreen wipers broken, which I was very, very cross about. The thought that he could quite happily let me drive him to the station and go off and leave me with no windscreen wipers, which is silly. But I do regret not having sort of sorted it all out before he'd gone, because he'd never sort of actually gone away before with us, not on good terms.
Today, the Evans family live just outside Portsmouth, in the house Elaine and her husband spent 10 years saving for. Ken Evans, his wife and children moved into their new home last year, just as the Falklands crisis was breaking.
We moved in on the Thursday and Ken had to leave on the Saturday to go back to his base in Scotland. So he only had 2 days actually in the house before, he went to the Falklands. I only knew because he was due home on the Friday morning, and I got a phone call at work to say that his leave was cancelled. And so I didn't see him, knowing he was going to the Falklands. I was told at one point that they were leaving on the Tuesday, so I'd arranged to phone on the Monday. But when I phoned on the Monday, he'd already gone. So as we weren't on the telephone, I didn't know where he was. I couldn't sort of say cheerio.
Elaine Evans joined in waving off the troops from the quayside without knowing on which ship her husband sailed.
I would have liked to have sort of said cheerio, but at that time it still didn't seem very real. It hadn't sunk in exactly what was happening, and you had a thought at the back of you that they would be back in a few days. They weren't going to be very long. Didn't think it was going to be as serious. I got a bit of a feeling of apprehension, really, to see all the guns and that, and you realise that there was definitely something going on, but still didn't sink in, really. Cheerful about going. I think they all were. It was their training. They'd all been trained for that all through their service life. It was something totally different to Ireland. So in a way I think there was a sense of excitement. I think as they got near and time dragged on, they got sort of a bit more apprehensive. And they were getting very fed up with the length of time. I know Ken mentioned in one of his letters that he just wished that they would make up their mind one way or the other, presumably either to sort of go ahead and fight or come back home. And then I think gradually, sort of the thought did come that there would be serious fighting, and there was the possibility that they just might not come home. He did sort of mention that in passing in one of his letters. He did say that they were having air attacks every day, being attacked by air, and that the Argentinians were getting better at it as the time went on. So I think they all felt that the sooner they were off that ship and on land, then the better they would be. Which seems a bit ironical, really.
Ken Evans' unit, 4-5 Commando, was one of the first ashore at Ajax Bay.
The weekend they landed, I was obsessed with finding out exactly what was happening, where Ken was, how he was, how and what the procedure was, telling anybody if anything had happened. I did, in fact, I think it was on the Friday, I heard on the news that Marines had been killed at Ajax Bay. And I did phone Plymouth to ask whether 4-5 were involved. And they did say anybody in particular, and I sort of said Ken's name, and they said no, nobody of that name. But then, of course, early on the next morning, Lieutenant Tasker came and told me that Ken had been killed.
What happened that morning?
Well, I was ironing in the dining room, and Lieutenant Tasker and Captain Graham came in through my garage and the back door, in fact, which the children had left open, and sort of told me. And it was peculiar, really, because you know, sort of my first reaction was, oh, hello, you know, and then I suddenly thought, well, what are they doing coming in the back door? And then, of course, I looked at their faces, and then I knew what they'd come for. So, my first initial reaction to Lieutenant Tasker was that there must have been a mistake, and he said no, there's no mistake, that he'd checked and checked and checked. Anthony and Vicky heard Lieutenant Tasker tell me, and they both went back out to play, ran out to play. I spoke to them a bit later on that day, and asked them if they'd, you know, realised what had happened. And they did. I was a bit upset, really, because Anthony sort of didn't cry or anything, and I felt he just didn't care, you know, which wasn't how it was. To my friends, Anthony said when it was getting a bit towards Christmas that he had to make me a Christmas cake because Ken always made me Christmas and birthday cakes, and he said, I've got to make Mummy a birthday cake. He said, because Daddy always did. So, but he never said anything like that to me. I only found out because my friend told me. But it's little things like that makes you realise that they do care, and I think that they are just genuinely protecting you. Because although you have family and friends around you, you haven't got anybody of your own. Even the first day, when I was first told that Ken had been killed, it sounds funny, but you just wanted somebody to give you a cuddle, you know? Noel Jones, the padre, he came to see me on about the Wednesday, and he was really lovely. He knocked on the door, and I answered the door, and he said, sort of, what sort of day have you had? Or what sort of day is it today? And I said, it's awful, you know. So he said, well, I've come at the right time, you know, sort of, and he just sort of put his arms around me and cuddled me, and I sort of cried all over his suit. So. But he was just what I needed.
"2,000 Marines came home on Canberra. Elaine Evans' husband wasn't among them.
The children were a bit upset, you know, and sort of said, well, they wished it was their dad that was coming home. It was quite upsetting. Felt a bit sort of, well, it was upsetting. It hurt quite a bit, actually, to see them all coming home. Not that I begrudged them coming home. It was just a bit hurtful, you know. I mean, it seemed as if you were forgotten all of a sudden. I did get a bit upset, and then as I was watching it, there was a knock on the door, and I answered the door, and there was somebody standing there with a bunch of flowers, and it was from a friend of mine, and she'd put on there on the note, just to let you know we're thinking of you, and I thought that was really lovely, that she was actually thinking of me at that particular time. She must have obviously known how I felt. to decide whether or not to have Ken's body brought home or to have him buried over on the Falklands. I decided more or less from the start that I felt he should stay over there. But I kept thinking that I'd made the wrong decision. I thought that I was being awful, sort of keeping him out there. I'd heard so much about it being such a bleak place, and I thought he's all on his own. In a place where it always seemed to be snowing or something. And I felt terrible, thinking that I'd left him like that.
The bodies which were returned came home in a container. Elaine Evans watched on television.
Well, when I saw them brought back and that, then I knew I'd made the right decision. In the Falklands, and they would always be honoured by the people over there. They would always be well looked after. The thought ran through my mind that if ever I was to move away from this area, or if anything happened to me, there'd be nobody to look after the grave. And to bring him to the local cemetery, which is, to me, if I was going to bring him home, I would have had him sort of near me. Nobody knows why they died, really, after a little while. St Paul's, all Vicky was interested in was sort of seeing Lady Diana and the Queen and everybody. It was full of sort of pomp and ceremony, but to me personally, it wasn't a memorial service that somehow Ken was involved in. It just seemed totally away from us. It was nothing to do with us really at all. It didn't feel as if we were a part of it. Whereas a service that was held in Old Portsmouth, where they planted a tree outside the old cathedral, that to me did have a lot of meaning, and I was sort of ever so pleased really that they'd thought of doing it. One of the problems was finally accepting that the person has been killed. I often sort of thought that if Ken sort of just should suddenly appear, I would sort of give him a kick. I said, you know, to express how I feel about having been left on my own, you know. But
Yeah, let's still join you then. Star. Star again.
for the year, it was very much a case of sort of living from one day to the next.
You got it.
We had a barn dance, which I went to, because they're good fun, you know, and everybody sort of mixes in. When you go to a dance, people are usually in couples, and it's quite hurtful, really, you know, because you're on your own. I think you help yourself cope with the situation by, on the surface, just carrying on as normal, as if they were just away, and you're sort of half expecting either the phone to ring or them to sort of just walk in the door for a weekend or a week's leave or whatever. I wanted to see where he died. I felt that once I'd been out there, it would become a reality and we would be settled then and we'd be able to sort of begin to live our lives again.
Elaine Evans and her children went to the Falklands with other British relatives whose dead were buried there.
None of us had been on a trip like that before, I don't think. So there was a sense of adventure. And I should imagine that the men felt very similar to this when they first started out. When we got near the islands, we actually came into the Falkland waters. The mood changed, as I would imagine the mood of the men changed as they got nearer the islands. As we went over where the Coventry was, we had a memorial service. It brought it all home to us, you know, sort of with a big bump, really. That's what we were there for, and we'd reached the place where it was all going to happen. I thought the islands were really nice. It reminded you of parts of home, really. It made you feel that it must have been better for the men because they could associate it with home, and it must have made them feel that they were really fighting for a part of their own. We saw where Ken was killed. It isn't really a very nice place, and all the end of the refrigeration unit had been blown away. All the rubble and everything had been pushed to one side, so in a way it was very hard to associate it with what had happened. I'd sort of wondered how I would feel when I got there, but it didn't upset me as much as I was expecting it to. The cemetery is absolutely lovely. It's absolutely beautiful. And I feel that the men that are buried there will always be honoured there. And I think Ken, for me, is in the right place. I think to go out there and to see it, and to see the graves and that, it did sort of settle everybody's mind. I don't think his life was wasted at all. They were fighting for the people who live in the Falklands, but it just seems a shame that couldn't have been stopped earlier. But once the necessity was there, well, then the men had to do their job, and I think they did it very well.
After the Falklands visit in April, Elaine Evans and her children began to look to the future.
That's mine, just to keep your mitts off.
At the present moment, I'm just beginning to start sort of thinking in terms of there being a future. I mean, to begin with, I just wouldn't plan ahead at all. I just didn't see any point. We'd made so many plans, and obviously now that they've all sort of gone. But we are virtually back to what we were before Ken was killed, except that there's always the feeling that he's just not, you know, just not going to be there again. Out of the film we made last year, the words that stick in their mind are my last words on it, that he was like a bad penny and he'd probably turn up again. I think they're going to plague me to death, I think. A lot of people have said, sort of, do I ever regret saying it? But it's only probably what I would have said to him anyway. You can't go through life thinking deeply before you ever say anything, in case if anything happens to that particular person, would you regret it? You just can't do that. I mean, normal married people and that, you say things like that to each other, and I mean, that's probably what I would have said to him anyway.
But there's another inscription on the stone, isn't there?
Yes, a Malay. I think it's Malay, and it's something that when Ken sent me flowers or anything like that, he'd always put the words on the card. And I wanted to put something just personal, just something that was between Ken and I.
What do they mean?
I'm not exactly sure what they mean. It could be something quite rude, but I mean, I think it's something nice, something like I love you, something like that.
Why did you put them on if you weren't quite sure what they were?
Well, I thought if he could say it to me, I could do the same.